morning, we're going to launch our new series, and you're going to learn why we have all these buckets. And if you're watching us online, we have a picture of those buckets, I think, to show you, because we've collected over 100 buckets. Some of them are on stage, some are out in the commons. And one of the things that all of us have in common is that we all have a lot of buckets. And I want you to know what my objective is before we even get into the content of today's message. I want you to know and understand that your feelings are valid. Your feelings are valid, but they don't determine your identity. Your feelings are valid, but they don't determine your identity. We live in a time and place where we put an incredible amount of weight on our feelings. And we do things because we feel we want to. We don't do things because we feel we don't want to. We pursue objectives because we feel it's the right thing to do. We fall in love based on a feeling. People tell me they fall out of love based on a feeling. Feelings are around us all the time, and we have to recognize that feelings are valid, but they don't determine our identity or your identity. And part of the way we tackle that, part of the way we look at this, is we recognize that we carry around our feelings in buckets. We carry around our expectations, our experiences, our failures. We carry around the things that cause us to be fearful. That's all based on how we carry around our buckets. And we've put some labels on buckets here on stage, but we didn't even attempt to make a label for everything. I've identified a few that I just want to talk about, these buckets that have labels. I mean, we have buckets that are labeled family and work and parents. I mean, some of you teenagers have a bucket labeled parents, and some of you older people are taking care of elderly parents, and you have a bucket labeled parents. Children, housing. I mean, even if all you do is rent an apartment, you still have to take care of your house. You still have to take care of that place where you live. We have a bucket labeled health and friends. That's a really important one for some people. Free time. We protect that like it's gold. We have a bucket labeled God, a bucket labeled money. We have a bucket labeled sex and church and retirement and marriage and dating. We have one bucket, and it's a really important bucket, that we label happiness. That's a big one. I as a pastor hear about this one all the time when people come to me and they say, well, surely this is okay because God wants me to be happy, doesn't he? And we put a lot of things in that bucket labeled happiness. And the problem with that bucket is happiness is very subjective. What makes you happy today probably won't make you happy tomorrow. And what made you happy last week probably isn't making you happy this week. Happiness is really subjective. Some deal with buckets that are labeled an ex-spouse and stepchildren. It's part of life. And then there are the buckets that are labeled social media and entertainment. I guess as a pastor, I should stand up here and just be honest and say, those are two buckets I wish I could burn. Or at least melt something, because we have put such an incredible emphasis on connecting with people on social media that we don't even know how to be honest with that anymore. What you see on social media isn't true 99.9% of the time. I mean, we've had to accept the fact that we can skew what we want other people to see when we post it on social media, what they want us to hear, how they want us to understand our lives, how we attempt to impress them or depress them. And the whole idea behind this is that somehow this is supposed to entertain us. And instead, I find it just adds layer upon layer upon layer of anxiety and disappointment and false expectations. And then there are two buckets that are hard. There are two buckets that, honestly, I would like to have not put these labels up on the screen, but we have buckets that are labeled secrets, because we have buckets that we don't want anybody to know about. And we keep those sealed really tightly. And we only open those lids when we feel like there's no other choice. Because we have secrets and we want to make sure those secrets are kept in the dark and they don't see the light of day. And then we have the addictions we deal with. And I know the first thing that most people think of when they think of addictions are drugs and alcohol, but there's coffee. I say that as the pastor of a church that fixes 5 or 6 huge urns of coffee every Sunday. But there are addictions to coffee. There's addictions to money. There are addictions to success and fulfillment. There are all kinds of addictions, and we have buckets that are full of these addictions. And the result of all this is that we spend an enormous amount of time living on the edge of disaster because we're trying to carry all these buckets around. One of the things that I really love that God allows me to do is to be involved with teenagers. I'm a part of our Sunday night ministry for teenagers that meets at 6:30 every Sunday night. And I get to be, with John Ross, lead the group of high school boys that are a part of that. I help with speech and plays and music and drama and all kinds of things at Pekin School because I really love to be with teenagers. But one of the hardest things for me as a pastor in the middle of that is to watch those teenagers accumulating more and more and more and more and more buckets. One of the greatest privileges that I have is being close to my 4 grandsons, geographically close, but also close enough to see their lives. And grandpas, they can sometimes get away with picking on their grandsons. So I'm going to do that this morning, and I want Brant, would you come up here, please? He just groaned, shrugged his shoulders, and rolled his eyes all at the same time. Brant, I would like you to pick up as many of these buckets as you can. And when you get a good grip on them, I want you to carry them all the way to the back door. No, you can't put them inside of each other because they're full. They're full. You got to pick up that one. That one's about half full of water. Down the middle aisle. That way the camera can get you for everybody at home to see. He managed to get a hold of 6 buckets. One of them's half full of water. He avoided the other bucket of water. But here's my question. How many buckets are you carrying? How many buckets are you carrying around? We're living on the edge of a disaster because we're dragging these buckets around. And some of you have come up with some unique solutions for carrying these buckets. You've got one around your neck, You've got, a board going across your shoulders, and you got some buckets hooked to that board. You've got a rope around your waist, and you're dragging one behind you, or maybe two or three. Because we all have these buckets. And they're full of expectations and experiences and disappointments and pain and grief and hurt and success and everything we ever have wanted or tried to avoid. You see, we all have a long list of experiences. And we do things with these experiences. We either celebrate them, hide them, or ignore them. But we all have experiences. Sometimes those experiences have caused us pain. Sometimes they've caused us grief. Sometimes they've caused us great joy. Sometimes those experiences have resulted in other experiences. And it's a domino effect in our lives when we watch all that God does in us and through us with those buckets full of experiences. And we find ourselves carrying these buckets around. And I believe that one of the most dangerous sets of buckets that we deal with are the buckets that are full of expectations. The buckets that are full of expectations. Because sometimes expectations are real, all right? I have this expectation that when the alarm goes off at 5:45 on Sunday morning, that I'm actually going to roll out of bed and, get going, that I'm not going to hit the snooze button, that I'm not going to say, let somebody else take care of church this week, that I'm not going to, to ignore it. But we all have expectations. Some of them are false expectations. Some of them are false expectations because, the pastor thinks that he can deal with 2 funerals and a family crisis and everything else that's regular in the life of a church and still get a bunch of life groups put together in 2 weeks' time. I blew it. It was a false expectation. It was unrealistic expectation. And you deal with this too. There are things in your lives where you have to say, blew it. Got to back up, put it in reverse, got to set down this bucket, have to reevaluate the expectations that are in the bucket, and then we'll find a way to move forward. So what do I mean when I talk about expectations? I mean that an expectation is the anticipation and belief that a mental image of the future will actually be fulfilled. The anticipation and belief that a mental image of the future will actually be fulfilled. We have a lot of those, don't we? Some of you have already watched some of those expectations disappear, and it was beyond your control. And then we have to figure out how to deal with the loss of that expectation and how to move on. Jesus came into a world where the religious leaders, the Hebrew people as a whole, had an expectation of what a Messiah was going to do. And how they arrived at this expectation is perfectly understandable. All you have to do is go back and read the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. And you can see how by picking this out of here and taking this out of context and just looking at this slice here, how the Hebrew people came to have an expectation that when the Messiah came, that he would gather together all the fighting men in Israel, and they would put on their swords and their shields and get on their horses and in their chariots, and they would drive out whatever country was oppressing them. When Jesus came, it was Rome. And he would get rid of them, and they would build a new palace, and he would reign in the same way that King David reigned, the greatest king that Israel had ever known. And that was their expectation for Jesus. And one of the reasons that they killed Jesus, one of the reasons they nailed him to a cross, is because he didn't meet their expectations. And unfortunately, my friends, we live with our expectations in such a way that oftentimes when we're disappointed, when the expectation does not come in the way that we thought it was going to, we kill the expectation. We call it divorce. We call it a job change. We call it filing for bankruptcy. We call it, living with the consequences of a mistake we made and trying to figure out how to go on. We have a legal process to change our names. We can create a new identity, move to a different place, move to a different part of the world, and start over because our expectations weren't met. People change schools, they move to a different house, they change friends. And Jesus comes into a world that was full of expectations, just like your expectations and my expectations. And he comes into this world, and he says to his disciples, he says to you and me, and Matthew records his words. In Matthew 11, Jesus says this, he says, come to me. It's really simple, friends. Jesus says, come to me. Come follow me. Come be with me. Come spend time with me. Come to me. I did something spontaneous this past week. Basically, on 12 hours' notice, I cleared my schedule, and I went down to watch my oldest grandson play showcase baseball for junior college down in Missouri. And it wasn't until I got home Friday night at 10 o'clock that I realized how much I needed that windshield time. No phone calls, no podcasts. I just spent time with Jesus. And yes, I was driving, but honestly, if you tried to get me to tell you what traffic was like between Osceola and Kearney, Missouri, I don't even know. I just know I pointed my car south, I put the cruise control in, and I steered it. And I had a wonderful time coming to Jesus. I needed to come to Jesus. Do you need to come to Jesus? He simply says, come to me. He says, come to me. Everyone who's weary and burdened, who's got all these buckets you're trying to carry, all these buckets you're trying to move around. And he says, you've come to me. If you're weary and burdened, I'm going to give you more expectations. I'm going to give you a busier schedule. I'm going to pile on all the things on your to-do list. I'm going to make you do it in 20 hours a day instead of 24. No, he says, I'm going to give you rest. Rest. And then he takes this image and he paints us a metaphor. And he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Now, when we think of a yoke, we think of that piece of wood that we've seen in movies and in pictures in our history books. And maybe if you've been to a farm demonstration, or maybe if you've traveled overseas, you've actually seen two animals that are yoked together with this piece of wood over their shoulders, and it attaches to a plow or whatever implement they're trying to use, a cart, whatever, and they've yoked these animals together. And the picture works because we would like to say, okay, I'm in this yoke with Jesus. I'm yoked with him, and he's going to carry part of the load, but I have to do my share. The image works. But can I just ask you to set aside that image? Because that's not the kind of yoke that Jesus was talking about. In Jesus' day, in the rabbinical system, with rabbis who had teachings of the Hebrew Bible, every rabbi and his group of followers had a set of interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, especially of the prophets, but also of the Pentateuch, the Mosaic Law, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And that interpretation, that set of teachings, was referred to as a rabbi's yoke. That set of teachings was called their yoke. And Jesus comes along and he says, my yoke is easy. And it was and it is. I mean, when he was asked to summarize all the law, he did it very easily. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty easy. Now, it's not so easy to execute from day to day. It requires our full attention. But it wasn't complicated, was it? My yoke is easy. My burden is light. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find confusion, frustration, agony, anxiety, depression. No, rest for your souls. No medical doctor can determine what your soul is. Your soul is the combination of your emotions and your existence, the combination of your ability to love and be loved. The soul is the essence of who you are. I have stood at many a graveside and said, and I said it at my mother's grave and at my wife's grave and at my father's grave, they're the skin and bones, but the soul, the real person, already went to heaven. The soul is the essence of who we are. And Jesus says, you're going to find rest for your soul, the essence of who you are. And then he goes back to that metaphor again. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, friends, you know where we get into trouble? Where we get into trouble is that we want this to be an easy yoke. You know, where easy is 6-foot wide letters, 12 feet tall, and the yoke part is like in 9-point type that we have to get a magnifying glass to see it. Because we don't see these together. We see easy without recognizing there's a responsibility that we have. But Jesus, when he said this, he said it for easy yoke. And he tells us that you and I have a responsibility. And I want us as a group, whether you're here in person or whether you're watching us online, I want us as a household of faith to learn how to deal with all these buckets. Because we're dragging around all these buckets in life. Brant carried 6 of them, but I guarantee that most of you have 18 to 20 that you're trying to hang on to. Sometimes you get 10 of them moved and you come back and get the other 10. Because you can't let them get too far away from you. Those are your expectations. Those are your buckets. They're full of your experiences, your pain, your disappointment. And we have to drag them around with us. But Jesus comes along and he says, no. You have tools that you can use to help empty those buckets. Maybe even to make some of those buckets go away. If you and I can learn to follow Jesus better, then you and I can learn how to leave some of those buckets behind and certainly empty some of the expectations out of them. And I know those expectations come from a spouse or from a parent, from a teacher, from a boss, from the neighbor across the street, from the guy you have coffee with in the morning, from the gal you see at the preschool, from all these expectations come in from all over the place. But Jesus says, I want you to learn the unforced rhythms of grace. The unforced rhythms of grace. Have you ever gone and visited and just sat and listened to a waterfall? I've had the privilege of not only being at Niagara Falls here in North America, but visiting Victoria Falls in Africa. And one of the favorite things that I have done, even as a kid when we went to a state park in Tennessee, I'd love to go and just sit by that waterfall. There was something about the rhythm, the tempo, the meter of that waterfall. Was it syncopated? Was it as tight a beat as you can get on an electronic metronome? No. It was an unforced rhythm. There was something about listening to that water come over the edge and hit the bottom that was rhythmic and refreshing and healing. And later, on in life, some scientists tried to tell me this because waterfalls produce a lot of negative ions, and when there are negative ions in the air, you feel better. Great, that's fine. I like the explanation, I guess. But take me to a waterfall, right? Because I want to experience the unforced rhythms of grace. Peterson, in his paraphrase of this same passage in Matthew, this is what he says. Are you tired? Worn out? Burned out on religion? Boy, there are a lot of people burned out on religion. I tell people all the time, I don't believe in religion. Come to me. Come to me. There it is again. Jesus saying, come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. You'll recover your life. The life that God intended you to live since the moment you were conceived. Since before you were conceived. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it, says Jesus. Oh, we get to watch how Jesus does this? Yep. In the next few weeks, we're going to look at how Jesus deals with all the expectations, because he says, learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I'm not going to lay anything on you. Next slide. I'm not going to lay anything on you heavy or ill-fitting. So keep company with me, and you'll learn how to live freely and lightly. It's the unforced rhythms of grace. Can you begin to imagine how dramatically your life could change if you could set down the buckets of expectations, the buckets of pain, the buckets of anxiety, the buckets of disappointment and hurt, the buckets of rejection? Can you begin to grasp how God can show you and me how to live in the unforced rhythms of grace and walk with him? He says, come to me. Just come follow me. My yoke is easy. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Simple. So how are we going to execute this? How are we going to put down these buckets and begin to leave them behind and move forward in such a way that we experience the unforced rhythms of grace? That's why this series is going to take a few weeks. Because I want you to come back. I want you to tune in again online. I want you to watch. I want you to learn. I want you to learn this with me, because if you think that I'm standing up here because I've got the unforced rhythms of grace down perfectly, you sadly mistaken. We're going to do this together. And we're going to learn together how we can set down these buckets that are so full that we're dragging around. They threaten us with disaster because we keep hauling them around. And God says to you and me, just come learn the unforced rhythms of grace. Let's do this together. And so that's my invitation to you. That's our invitation to you. We want to come together to worship God, to lift up His name, to make sure that He knows that our trust is fully in Him, and then to trust Him enough to speak to us and lead us and show us how to live in the unforced rhythms of grace. Don't miss next week. This is a very important series. Anybody who's been around me will tell you I've been talking about this and praying about this and reading books about this and working on this since May. And I am thrilled that we get to do this together because I believe with all my heart that God wants you to experience the unforced rhythms of grace. It starts today. If you have not made a personal decision to follow Jesus, today is the day. Today is the day for you to plant your flag and say, I'm going to name Him as Lord, the King, Master, Boss, Conductor, and Leader of my life. And I'm going to give Him the center seat. And I'm going to allow Him to direct me and lead me and guide me. That's where it starts. So if you haven't made that decision, I invite you to make a decision to follow Jesus, to follow Him, to learn the unforced rhythms of grace. Would you pray with me? Father, if there are people that can hear my voice in the Commons, in this room, online, if there are people who can hear my voice who have not made that decision to follow you, I pray that you would speak to them in this moment and give them the courage to confess their need for you and to accept you as the Lord, the King, the Master, the Leader, the Conductor, the Boss of their lives. I pray, Lord, for those of us who have made that decision and who keep climbing back into the center, I pray that once again you would give us the courage to make the decision to get down out of the center and put you back in that position of leadership. And I ask, Lord, that in all of this, we would learn together how to live in the unforced rhythms of grace. Thank you. Thank you for your presence here. Thank you for the power of your word. Thank you for the example of your Son, Jesus. And we pray all these things in His name. Amen. Thank you so much for being here. Don't miss next week.